Well, welcome everyone to the joint webinar from the Joseph Roundtree Foundation and Runnymede Trust on ethnicity and COVID-19, addressing the impact on the pandemic on Black and minority ethnic people. So my name is Andrea Barry. I'm a senior analyst at the Joseph Roundtree Foundation and one of the authors of the UK Poverty 2020-2021 report. I'm so pleased to see so many people joining the webinar. But first, let me just quickly run through our expert panels. First, we have Dr. Halima Begum, from Chief Executive at Runnymede Trust. Next is Anake Olayton, Enabling Lives Project Manager at First Love Foundation. And finally, Tony McKenzie, who is a Senior Participation Officer at Joseph Roundtree Foundation. Before we delve into the topic, I just have a bit of housekeeping to discuss. So all questions for the panel will be done at the end in a 20-minute Q&A. So please write them in the chat. All materials will be provided at the end of the webinar, and this webinar will be recorded. So first, let's just begin with a brief overview of the report findings. So UK Poverty 2020-21 has shown that while our country is in the same storm, we are not in the same boat. The pandemic has highlighted the insecurity pulling many low-paid workers into poverty, both through unemployment and low-paid, poor quality jobs and lack of progression. And many of the groups most at risk of poverty have been hit hardest by the pandemic, such as Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers. So workers from these groups face the injustice of being 14% more likely to be made unemployed and 13% less likely to be furloughed. Especially Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups already had the highest in-work poverty rate pre-COVID at about 34%. 35% of private renters and 42% of social renters were working in the sectors hardest hit by COVID-19, and 1 in 3 were furloughed. But 30% of private renters were worried about paying their rent through the winter. This is especially stark for Black households, as over 44% of Black households are social renters and 23% are private renters. They are also the least likely to be homeowners and with providing some type of protection. However, this is not a surprise completely. Black, Asian, and minority ethnic households were barely keeping their heads above water before the pandemic, with an unacceptable 34% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi workers in in-work poverty, as I said previously. 42 in every 100 people and households headed by someone of a Black ethnicity were in poverty, a level of poverty that has barely changed for 25 years. 46 in every 100 people in households headed by someone of Pakistani ethnicity were in poverty, and an unacceptable 53 in every 100 people in households headed by someone of Bangladeshi ethnicity were in poverty. JRF research suggests that Pakistani and Bangladeshi workers are one of the most risks in the coming wave of job losses. So with that in mind, can I please welcome Dr. Halima Begum, Chief Executive of the Runnymede Trust, who will discuss Runnymede Trust research and policy. Halima has held senior leadership positions across policy, programs, and research with a range of organizations, including the FCO, the British Council, and the Lego Foundation. Halima's experience spans education, equality, human rights, public health, the environment, and post-conflict reconstruction. And as a disabled Muslim woman raised in London, Halima is a lifelong campaigner for equality and civil rights. In the early 1990s, she co-founded Women Against Racism to combat the rising incidence of racial and religious intolerance in the East End. Today, she chairs the UK Women's Environmental Network and sits on the board of various organizations. So please, Halima, the floor is yours. Halima, I think you're muted. I got to do it. It's a bingo. I win.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea, for such a generous introduction and such a kind and trusted invitation to talk about what has been difficult, painful journey in the last 12 months with COVID and its impact on Black and minority ethnic communities. So I look forward to a conversation with Tony, Annika, and others around, how we're getting by, how we're getting through, what are we feeling, as well as the stats that we will refer to. So I work at the Runnymede Trust. We work with a very small and agile team that's been responding to COVID real time, so ever since the Public Health England report was published in March 2020, first, I think, indicating the worrying disproportionate impact on Black and minority communities. Those of us who are on the front line didn't need the stats. We already knew that our communities were impacted greatly. We already knew that. And I suppose when the Public Health England report came out, our worst fears came true, because it wasn't just a problem that everybody was facing evenly. Those of us who were most impacted, less resilient, overexposed, were feeling the brunt of it. So Runnymede quickly needed to get into that space to look at why that was happening. So we produced our report on overexposure and under protection in the summer. So that was June 2020. And it became very clear, Andrea, those statistics that you've just described, which were very recent from January 2021, but you can track that back to the summer, where we found in our own research that the reason for that disproportionality was our overexposure. So we were overexposed because we were employed. A third of BME communities were working outside their homes during peak pandemic, right? So none of us were at home. We were not furloughed. We were not protected. We were out there on the front line in precarious jobs. Naturally, we were overexposed. And those of us who were not out there working in precarious jobs or key worker jobs, we were living in overcrowded situations where if one of us were to contract COVID, we're not able to self-isolate. For all sorts of reasons, we have been overexposed compared to the rest of the population. But even beyond COVID and its immediate impact, if you look at our economic situation as a group, for every £1 of white British wealth, right, Pakistani and Bangladeshi households have around 10 pence of that wealth. I mean, just imagine the income inequality between £1, every £1 of wealth that white British people have, and Bangladeshi and Pakistani households that have like 10p. So you could just see the enormous income inequality there. And then having disproportionate impact of COVID and job losses on top. I mean, I cannot begin to explain how difficult the recovery of COVID will be from BME communities. So, you know, I was on Newsnight the other day and they were discussing what is an acceptable level of risk for COVID. And my response back was, well, it should be zero acceptance really, because in any case, we know that our communities are impacted in different ways. And if you cannot pull through our communities, then no risk is acceptable. So even getting to this sense of what is an acceptable level of risk, say in the way that we live with flu, feels like an impossible question for us to answer, because we haven't faced this pandemic in the same way. We have been impacted quite severely. So we remain really concerned, and even to this week, you know, looking at the kind of equity issues that impact on our service take-up and how we protect ourselves. So all of those older questions around health inequalities, unequal access to the services, any public services, these are having a knock-on impact on the way we are protected. So even with the vaccine conversation, that you will know that most people are focusing on a conversation around vaccine hesitancy, but we're saying, oh yeah, maybe there's some hesitancy there, but push the conversation to vaccine equity, because groups that are least able to access services will have more questions about new drugs or new services, and you need to be able to build their confidence. We need to be able to say, look, maybe in the past, you haven't always felt like the services or the authorities have had your back. We know that Black and minority ethnic communities and Black people in particular have a crisis of confidence in the system. So you would have seen the UK Parliament's report on racism affecting Black communities, which showed that 70% of Black people in this country felt like the three institutions that really matter, that should have our back, the NHS, the Home Office and the criminal justice system, did not have their backs. Now, are we surprised that we have a lower level of vaccine uptake from those communities? Well, no, I'm not surprised. So we need to think about building that confidence back fast. But the other side of that problem is distribution. The way the vaccine policy was rolled out, it was all based around age. We know that Black and ethnic minority communities are younger by their profile, right? So I was feeling incredibly concerned that, okay, by the time, you know, people under 50 get vaccinated, that's most of our communities. We, as a group, have been disproportionately impacted, but the vaccine will get to us by the summer. How is that possible, or even equitable, or even ethical? So thank God the Joint Vaccination Committee for Immunisation last week made a decision by proxy and algorithms to give priority to ethnicity, deprivation, and body mass weight, for example, because that basically means the government has by default acknowledged that race and poverty and ethnicity actually have a factor to play in the overexposure of COVID. When we started campaigning and lobbying for more recognition of structural inequalities and the fact that race and class matter and explain why we've been so vulnerable, the government wasn't so convinced. In fact, they were not listening. But this week, or sorry, last week, I think we've got a formal recognition from government that race and class have attributed to the vulnerability of COVID on our communities. And once you get that recognition, we can start talking about solutions, right? Now, immediately this week, you will have heard lots in the newspapers around the disease of poverty. So COVID affecting groups that are experiencing poverty in ways that isn't the case for affluent communities in Richmond, for example, right? So once you get that recognition, the UK scientists then also fall in line as well. And it means that our communities are protected better. So we are now pushing hard, by the way, with the conversation around vaccine equity. Get the vaccine out to the doorsteps as close to our communities as possible. In the way, for example, in the past where we've supported mothers from low-income communities to talk about the benefits of the smear test, for example, that would help screen out cancer. We found in the past that affluent middle-class mothers were accessing the smear test far more than mothers from low-income groups of whatever ethnicity. Well, there was a way to get around that, which was to take mobile vaccination units to the doorsteps. We're suggesting that the government and the NHS think very hard about taking that vaccine closer to the doorsteps to our communities, many of whom, by the way, Black Bangladeshi, Pakistani households, they live in multi-generational households. So even vaccinating an elder member of that household isn't going to work because our overexposure was always related to overcrowding, right? So we're going to have to look at entire families and households and protect them. So that is happening, and I'm glad that the government listened, and we just need to keep at it. We're not denying that there's a lack of confidence in how groups are wanting to take their vaccine, but if we only focus on the reluctance of the vaccine, it's almost as though we're shifting the blame and the responsibility onto vulnerable communities or communities that have been more at risk. So let's try and push that conversation forward. As you can see, I've just put an image up there to just show where we've come from since June. We started with our report on understanding why groups were overexposed and underprotected. And for those of us who are a bit new to the topic, by overexposure, we just mean, having to work in jobs that are insecure and precarious, literally overexposed in the environment because we're not privileged enough to be furloughed. And by underprotected, we mean, having the ability to argue for your rights at work. So if you remember, many of the healthcare workers in the NHS that were impacted by COVID at the beginning were BME groups. So these were middle-class health workers, right? So they're not working-class health workers, but nevertheless, they were disproportionately impacted. So that tells you something about the ability to ask for protection at work. So under protection, which has a role to play in explaining away our vulnerability, is also something that we've been concerned about, and the role that racism has to play. But just going back to June, looking at the overexposure and the underprotection, and coming back to this week where we're talking about jabs and taking the jabs closer to the doorstep, it just tells you what the COVID journey has been, and it's been relentless. We cannot afford to stop. We need to keep making the argument as to why our groups are most at risk and what kind of protection is desperately needed. And then we need to talk about the exit and the recovery and the economic impact. I mentioned that a third of our households will have lost a worker. My God, how are we going to deal with income inequality and so on? And the final thing I wanted to leave us with is a general conversation around when we talk about groups that are impacted by poverty, when we talk about inequality increasing in the last 10 years or child poverty increasing and so on, which is a lot of the work that we're involved with in this group, we need to be very specific about which groups of people that we're discussing. Because if we just talk about child poverty increasing at levels of unacceptable statistics, we're actually doing a disservice if we don't say who those children are. We do need to say, actually, Bangladeshi and Pakistani families in particular experiencing child poverty over above the national rate, because as soon as we name the specifics of the challenge, we can get to our solutions faster. And the one thing that we do know from the tragic murder of George Floyd last summer was that people are not willing to accept the status quo and a level of change that means that 40 years later, we're still asking the question, why was someone like George Floyd murdered, or the subsequent Brits in the UK that suffer in the criminal justice system? The reason why that happens is because we're not shifting the needle. We're not understanding who it is that's most at risk and actually talking about specific solutions that would help. So if we want to shift the needle on child poverty or other areas of social justice, we need to start working with Black-led groups, BME-led groups in partnership, who will shift the needle and change the outcomes that we want to see change. So I'll stop here and look forward to Tony and Annika picking up the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a really interesting and insightful talk, and I think it will complement Annika Layton quite nicely. So if I can, I will go ahead and move on to Annika. She is the Enabling Lives Project Manager at First Love Foundation, a charity focused on putting an end to into poverty in London. First Love Foundation exists to support people through a journey out of poverty by empowering them to create independent lives for themselves. Annika previously had a successful career in the social care field, managing and commissioning local authority and community services. Annika is a passionate advocate for social justice and believes that poverty is a shame to our nation, and she would like to see Britain without poverty. Annika, the floor is yours. And you are muted.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. I work in Tower Hamlets in East London, a borough which has been hugely impacted by COVID. May we get the next slide, please? Thank you. And at First Love Foundation, we believe that poverty is not optional. May we get the next slide, please? I want to tell you today about who we've supported through the past year. I want to tell you about why BAME individuals have been hugely impacted by COVID in Tower Hamlets and the City of London where we work. And I want to give you our recommendations for change. May we get the next slide, please? 319%. This is by how much First Love Foundation have had to scale our services since March the 16th, 2020, when COVID hit with such a hard impact in our boroughs where we work. Can I get the next slide, please? In the past year, we have worked with 7,884 individuals. That's men, women, and children. Now, 41% of London is from the BAME community, and 39% of Londoners who are from the BAME communities are living in poverty. Now, in Tower Hamlets, 55% of our community is BAME, and of those, 34% are from the Bangladeshi communities. And what we've seen at the front line is that our Bangladeshi and BAME communities are 30% more likely to need services, to be affected by COVID and by all the other social determinants that have left people in poverty than our white population. And we found that 38% more were directly related, had directly related COVID-19 issues than in our white communities. May we get the next slide, please? So I want to tell you about what we've been seeing on the front line, about the complexities that we've encountered. And those complexities are directly related to COVID-19. We've worked with people who are what are called the working poor, people who are in low-paid jobs. We're working with people who are on low incomes because they're on benefits only. They're relying on universal credit. We're also seeing huge issues with immigration, people who have no recourse to public funds. We're also encountering people who are just for the first time having to claim benefits, and people who also have the double impact of having ESOL issues as well. And sadly, what we have also seen a drastic rise in is domestic abuse. May we get the next slide, please? So I want to talk to you about why in Tower Hamlets our BAME communities have been so disproportionately impacted by COVID. And these are in a variety of ways. In terms of housing, now Tower Hamlets has a major housing issue. We've got around 23,000 people on the housing list. People live in overcrowded accommodation, and we also have people living in multi-generational households. So we found we had one family with 18 people living in one home. And this was 4 generations, great-grandparents, grandparents, parents and their children. We know that this has been highly indicated for the transmission of COVID. We also have a large population, 8% of people in Tower Hamlets don't speak fluent English and have ESOL issues. And getting information to people in their language in time has been an issue. We also have a high population of maternal-only households. And the issue here is that if mum gets sick, who's looking after those children? We've got mums who are isolated, who've got children with SEND needs, children with disabilities. Maybe they are carers for elder parents as well. And the other issue that we have that Halima touched on is that lack of trust between our communities and the statutory agencies, especially health. May we get the next slide, please? Thank you. So what I'd like you to do is to meet our client, Nadia. Nadia is a real person. She is from the South Asian area. She's a nurse working in the NHS. She's 64 years old. And she catches COVID working on the front line in a hospital in the north of England. She's then airlifted by air ambulance to the Royal London Hospital, which is in Tower Hamlets. She's intubated, she's in and out of a coma for over 2 months. Nadia contracts long COVID. Eventually, she's discharged back home. Her brother leaves his job to come and become her personal carer. Nadia has never before claimed any benefit. She's been agile, she's been independent, and all of a sudden she's having to learn to navigate the benefits system. Nadia is also hugely at risk of eviction because she hasn't paid her rent for 5 months while she's been in hospital. She gets referred by the Royal London Hospital to our service. And this is what we're able to do. We've got a dedicated team of project workers. We've got a holistic model of engagement, which in 2014, the all-party parliamentary group termed the best model for tackling poverty in the UK. We work with people from end to end, so from referral through to exit. So they enter our service in absolute crisis. Many of the people we work with are facing eviction in the next few days. We put in place a comprehensive triage assessment of needs. So we've got to understand what is the person dealing with so that we can then look at the best pathway and work with them at their pace to resolve their issues. We're looking at working closely with partner agencies in the local authority. We're looking at working closely with the housing provider to ensure that Nadia doesn't lose her home. Nadia is also unable to pay her bills because she's not been working. She's got debts, so we also put debt management support in place. There are also, apart from the health issues and the ongoing health management issues, there's also the issues of isolation and emotional health issues going on as well. So Nadia then starts to access our befriending service, which was set up as a direct result of COVID because we were working with people who were facing so much isolation and loneliness and depression and anxiety. And I can't forget a conversation I had with somebody in April last year, a woman who told me that she'd been on her own for 53 days without seeing anyone. These were the kinds of issues that our communities are facing. Can we get the next slide, please? So I want to tell you about our recommendations. You see, because in Tower Hamlets, being from the BAME community means that you're experiencing entrenched inequalities. We're looking at structural and institutional racism. And there's a lack of protection, especially if you are no recourse to public funds. You're facing all these barriers that stop you from accessing the opportunities that will help you to redress your situation. And our communities in Tower Hamlets are at the intersections of all our social fault lines. They're experiencing these kind of tectonic plates, and they're at risk in so many ways that often aren't highlighted. So there's a lot of hidden poverty. There's hidden challenges that our communities are facing, not just the ones I've talked about that are like ESOL, but things like domestic abuse, which are hidden and which affect children and which leave people, especially maternal households, in entrenched poverty. So our first recommendation from our experience of working at the front line is scrap the benefits cap. And I'm going to repeat that, scrap the cap. People who live in inner city areas face higher rent charges, and it means often that the local housing allowance isn't meeting those rent charges, and people are then using their personal allowance from universal credit to top up their rent. It leaves children in poverty. So that's the first thing, scrap the benefits cap. Our second recommendation is that we need to be supporting our BAME communities better to access job opportunities. Now, given what I've said earlier about our communities facing higher challenges because of issues such as ESOL, English as a second language, and entering the job market, which is largely now becoming online, becomes a real challenge. So we need to ensure that there is better access to the support systems that will help people access any kind of new streams of employment which are going to be online. We've got a program called Tower Talent, which we piloted last year. And of that cohort, 90% of the people on that program were from the BAME community. But what we discovered is that with intensive support, with dedicated support, with working alongside employers who offer apprenticeships, we can support people into work. And we found that 60% of the clients we worked with through our Tower Talent program last year were able to get interviews and be offered jobs. That lifts them out of poverty. It means that they are not subject to the benefits cap. Our next recommendation is around tenancy sustainment. We know that come next month, when the moratorium on evictions is lifted, that many people whose evictions have been staved over the last year are going to be facing eviction. So we want to see a more robust use of things like DHPs, which are discretionary housing payments that are dispersed by councils. We need to see the government giving councils more money to sustain people in their accommodation at this time, especially children, because we know that once a family are evicted from somewhere, children go into temporary accommodation, probably outside of their home borough, they have to move schools, there's a whole tectonic plate shift in their lives, in their support systems, all of that is lost. Communities are being broken by people being in temporary accommodation. So we know that this is not a solution. We need to see more money being poured into benefits to sustain people to live in their local communities. And fourthly, we want to see a review of the no recourse to public funds system. Now, we have seen directly on the front line in this past year, two sets of people affected. Those who have the leave to remain in the UK and to work in the UK, and who have lost their jobs because of COVID. These people have lived in this country, have worked here and have paid taxes, but cannot access a benefit system which would support them through this crisis. And then on the other hand, we have people who are refugees and asylum seekers who are waiting for their cases to be resolved and who are from BAME communities and who cannot access the benefit system. So we've got two groups of people who are being left in destitution, putting huge pressure on social services, children's social care, adult social care. A review of this system is desperately needed to stop people falling not into poverty, but into abject destitution. Can we get the next slide, please? So I'd like to repeat, poverty is not optional. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Annika. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session. So we've had quite a bit of discussion about your presentation, especially. So thank you. I'm just going to go now to Tony. Tony McKenzie is a Senior Participation Officer at JRF. He has lived experiences of poverty and has recently joined JRF. Before this, he was the member involvement coordinator at Crisis. Tony is passionate about working with and alongside people with lived experience as equals to ensure services are co-produced. Tony is also the lead citizen social scientist at the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL and a member of the London Prosperity Board, and undertakes research projects that are co-designed and carried out with citizen social scientists. I'm a bit jealous with this next one, but he is an avid adventurer who has climbed Kilimanjaro, toured Cuba by bicycle, and trekked the Patagonia. Tony, how are you? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Wow, first of all, I just need to say thank you to yourself, Andrea, Halima, and Annika for setting the context, providing the data, and a lot of the things that I was going to say have been covered. So I'm just been ticking them off. But one of the things I will talk about is, okay, we're very clear on what the issues, what the problems are. We're very clear on what needs to be happening in terms of change. And one of the agents of that change, for me, should be for the people who are experiencing poverty. Their voices need to be included in discussions about how we can readdress the balance, how we can bring about the systemic change that is needed. And if I could just use an analogy of building a house. If you build a house with just an interior decorator, it's not going to be a good house. You're going to need the architect, you're going to need chippies, you're going to need plumbers, you're going to need a group of people who've got skills and experiences in certain areas. And I think often when we're talking about poverty and we're talking about solutions and changes, when decisions are made at a level that doesn't include people who are experiencing, it's not a good fit. So we really need to include the people with lived experience of poverty, of homelessness, of health inequalities, of work insecurity. All of these groups of people need to be included when we're talking about how do we get back to a level that is fair and is there to support people when things happen. The pandemic was nobody's fault as such. It happened to all of us. What it did highlight is the inequalities that were already there. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my journey, about my experience. I grew up in London, originally born in Northwest London, to a stereotypical large family, lots of siblings, brothers and sisters. And one of the things I remember was how hard my mum worked. So I grew up in a single parent home, and my mum worked so incredibly hard. And her attitude was she would literally try and do anything. And often she had 2 or 3 jobs, whether that was childminding, cleaning, doing repairs. And that's something that is replicated in our community by so many people that when Helena was talking about not having a choice, but to keep going out to work because we don't have the savings, because we don't have other choices really. If we don't go out and work, as in the case study that Annika brought up, who's going to look after the kids? Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to do all the things that needs to be done? And growing up and watching my mum do her very best to make ends meet. And that's something that is quite an interesting phrase in the Black and ethnic and Asian community, because sometimes we don't recognize ourselves as being in poverty, but we'd use phrases like making ends meet, a little side hustle, or doing what we got to do until we can level things out and get on top. And sometimes I think when you talk to um, people who are experiencing poverty, they don't recognize themselves in that. But when you talk about the issues, they're like 100. Yep, that's definitely me. So I grew up and life was good. Um, and then I suppose in later in adult life, I took a bit of a stumble, a bit of a turn, and my life really disintegrated. Things just fell apart. It was like I often describe it like when you snag a bit of thread and it just pulls and things unravel, and that's what kind of happened for me. Um, and through that time, I did approach services, and as a Black person growing up in London, I faced racism at quite overt levels, but also at quite subtle levels. And it's those subtle levels that is harder to challenge. It's those subtle levels that when we talk about the mistrust between our community and institutions, it's because we've daily had this chipping away at us. When you think about work, health, and housing, these are, cornerstones of our society, cornerstones of what people need to prosper, what people need to develop and as Maslow say, reach their full potential. But when you're faced with barriers at all of these levels, then we just tend to buckle down and get on with it. That's the reality. We tend to buckle down and get on with it. Through the work I've been doing with people with lived experience of poverty and of homelessness, there's a recurring word that always comes up, and it's a word that we never use, but people always use about us, and that word is resilience. You know, and we can't underestimate the power of resilience. And resilience comes from having so many knocks in life, and sometimes you can't get up that day, but the actual thing about just getting up, keep moving, trying to do better, that's where resilience comes from. And it's something that, again, that the people I'm working with, and I see, I hear incredible stories, but the will to survive, the will to, no matter what life throws at me, I will continue is very incredible. And I think when we talk about um, that COVID is highlighted, and I really like the term that Halima used around vaccine equity. And we need to stop victim blaming. We need to stop saying it's your fault, that you're not um, taking up the vaccine. What is wrong with you? What is wrong with us is that we've been on the sharp end of racism for such a long time. And over the years, I've heard us talk about institutional racism. I've heard us talk about sameness and difference, diversity, unconscious bias. But whatever we try and relabel it, it's about that inequality. It's about people not being treated um, as a human being. It's about people not being respected for the skills and the qualities they have. All the solutions lie in all of us, not just a select few who, because of class or the country they're born in or whatever, mean that they get to make all the decisions, all the powers. When I bring people together to look at problems, to look at what can be done, some very novel ideas come out, some very off the wall ideas come out. But what we do is together we say, okay, how might we, or what would, imagine what would happen if we tried this, if we done that. And it's those agents of change, including people who are experiencing inequalities, to be part of that process, to be part of that decision making process about what is important to us, how we to bring about change, and how that change could not just be a sticking plaster, and some of the solutions have been a bit short term, and there's a lot of people very worried, things like the £20 uplift. People literally don't know what's going to happen with that. Nika was talking about the benefit cap. We, with all that uncertainty, means that people's quality of life deteriorates. And when we talk about coming up with solutions, when we talk about building back better, what we're talking about also is sustainability. How can we do this so it lasts? And also not think of it as a fixed thing, but something that needs constant attention, something that needs us to be looking at it, be addressing it time and time again, because life isn't one dimensional. There's many shades, there's many hues. And I think the moment we stop trying to come up with one size fits all, and we try to think about how can we see the individual, how can we meet that individual need, how can we do things that is going to impact on people's lives in a positive way, not just create the basics. I think we'll be moving closer to a place where society will become more equal. And I think it's a work in progress. We're going to have to be continuously looking at this. The stats, the reports, we know this. It's out there. We know this. The government should have got more information than they actually release. That's absolutely fine. What we need to do is say, okay, let's become actionable. Let's put what we know into practice to bring about real change for real people.
Tony, can I just stop you there? I thought that was a really good point, actually, and a really good segue actually into our Q&A, because one of the questions that I have for all of the panelists especially is, how do we make sure people with lived experiences are deeply involved in the co-production of work? Because as you said before, you cannot build a house without all of the people participating equally to ensure that every part is done it completely. Halima, I might ask your opinion on that first, if you don't mind.
Yes, Andrea, I'm in a very emotional space listening to Annika and Tony still, because everything that you raised is stuff that we live with, right? So I'm going to try and kind of answer that question in a more rational way. It was so compelling, Tony. Thank you. So how do we co-create? How do we make the space for lived experiences? I think I'd start by saying that many of us who work in this space are also people who carry lived experiences as well. And I suppose, especially in the race equity space, I'd say that most of us have had experience of racism, right? So that is our lived experience. And to be given that space to bring that to the fore and not be afraid to talk about it. Rewind back to 12 months ago, before I suppose the parameters of what is safe or unsafe to speak about on racism changed somewhat. But I do remember back 12 months ago, it wasn't as easy to talk about racism, actually. It's that thing, like you start talking about it, people leave the dinner table or the corporate table, or you can only talk about it in the designated diversity space. But outside of that, oh, that's a bit difficult. Whereas with gender inequality and other like climate change and so on, you can always talk about it. But whenever it came to race, not so. So just to be aware that most of us are actually carrying that lived experience. We do not just have to create the structure. Understand that Tony, Annika, Andrea, we all have that lived experience, and to acknowledge that. But I suppose more structurally and formally, we need to start shifting towards not just a co-created model, but actually recruiting staff, colleagues, leaders from lived experiences. Like I personally have a challenge with people separating out lived experience from structures of authority and experts. I often go to all these spaces where I'm propped up as the data expert. I was on BBC with Hugh Pym the other day, and I was apparently the expert, and then somebody else was the non-expert. And I said, Hugh, I actually live in Tower Hamlets, and yes, I might have a national platform, but I am living and breathing the issues that actually my communities face. So I think we need to kind of do away with some of the categories, but more formally think about hiring people with lived experience as leaders, because they can then shape and create that space and that culture, as well as building in structures around co-creation and research that others are co-creating. So I think you could look at a more staggered, scaffolded approach and think about how quickly you want to bring lived experiences into our policy structures. So if you want to shift the needle, going to have to hire lived experience leaders as well as co-creative spaces. And you'll notice in a lot of the funding applications that we get to fill out these days, they ask the question, how reflective is your leadership of lived experiences? Now, I was able to answer that question fairly comfortably, but I don't think many of us can, but I think even the funders are saying, are you recruiting at your leadership level, not just with co-creative structures? So that would be one way of looking at that question. Great,
thank you. Anna Kay, did you have a thought about it as well? You are muted. It's a bingo.
I very much agree with Halima. There has to be that level of involvement, from recruitment, at your board level, at your trustee level, even on your interview panels, you must involve service users and people who've got lived experience in meaningful ways. You need to, gain what are their opinions, what have their experiences been, what have their challenges been, how do they see this situation being resolved rather than, being told how it should be resolved. I think, we need to look again at every part of the process, of working, co-designing, co-delivering with people. And we need to look at the kind of community engagement model as well to ensure that, from the bottom up rather than the top down, there is that level of real meaningful engagement, understanding, listening, learning, involving people who have got lived experience.
Thank you. And Tony, would you like to add anything else? This is your area.
I'm just nodding and smiling. I completely agree with everything that everybody has said. My journey into JNRF also meant that I'd done an apprenticeship, and I think as well as creating opportunities for people, we need some more level entry jobs for people with who experience poverty, and also people from Black and Asian communities. We also need to have the support network within the organisation to support people as well, because that journey, you can't just go from, for example, being homeless to being a chief executive. It's not like that. Something that just to keep the language really simple, I really liked when Annika said, we got to involve people in meaningful ways. So we're not talking about tokenism. We're not talking about nice to have, we're talking about a real commitment. One of the things that we do at JRF is we work with groups that have an issue that they want to campaign about, and we co-design that together. We work it up together. And I think it takes a lot of time, and there's some ups and some downs and what have you, but this is the process that we have to go through. We really need all the people around the table, not just some of the people.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Just turning to some of the questions in the Q&A. Thank you everyone for writing all of your questions. There's quite a few, but I think one of the ones that stuck with me first was from, I'm so sorry if I say your name incorrectly. It is probably the American accent. Rameza Zaker, who said, what in your opinion are the structural inequalities within housing and employment pre-COVID that may lead to an exacerbation of COVID within BAME communities? And I'm gonna start again with Halima for that, if you don't mind. And please excuse my cat. She decided she needed a cuddle. So she's meowing behind me.
Thank you, Andrea. So the question was around specifically about the structural inequalities in housing. Yeah, so as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental reason why BME communities were overexposed was to do with housing. Like, even if you don't live in multi-generational homes, which Bangladeshis and Pakistanis do, even if you didn't, Most of our BME communities come from low-income backgrounds. You're likely to be in a council estate, and note, I say council estate, not affordable homes, council estates in places that are small and cramped, and then you're unable to get to a balcony or a green space or a garden, right? So that, I mean, imagine for a whole year, we've had families just like trapped in homes where they can barely breathe, right? A lot of the people I grew up with in our council homes, you know, we wanted to like leave our homes to get green space or walk. Imagine now for a whole year having to be in that space, confined, not able to go out, maybe lacking internet, broadband, and so on for a whole year. That is the impact of COVID on our communities. Why is it like that? Well, there's a structural issue in inner cities in general around housing pressure, housing stock, the lack of council homes. And note again, I say council homes, not affordable homes, because actually affordable homes isn't really affordable for most people who are needing, as you said, Annika, you know, scrap the benefit cap, you know, having to go into your personal finances to just pay the bills. These aren't going to be the families that are going to afford the affordable homes. So we need to think about housing justice and equity for our families, because let's face it, this globally infectious diseases pandemic isn't going to be the last. We're going to probably see a few more of these pandemics coming. So what can we learn? Well, if housing was a major obstacle and a constraint and a reason for why we were overexposed, then we need to start looking at housing justice for our communities. And obviously anything that benefits our communities who are more precarious benefits the whole communities in the country. Because if you start designing from those that are hit worse by this pandemic, you will almost certainly cover everybody. So it's not like a special argument for Black and minority communities. It's thinking about redesigning public services with those that are most at risk in mind, and everybody benefits. So structural inequalities to do with housing, I think, goes a long way. And, you know, I would ask the housing minister to be focusing on that, rather than, if you recall, a few weeks ago, he was more concerned about which statues are being pulled away in the streets of the UK. I should add statues of people who are no longer living, of course. I'd rather he focused on people's housing situations as we currently come out of this pandemic. And if housing was one of the reasons why we were vulnerable, at risk, and overexposed, what are the solutions for the housing crisis? Never mind homelessness as well. So I actually think, you know, the pandemic response has been too focused on just the health side. Where's the economic impact? Where's the housing impact? We've not really discussed that. That is what I would like the leadership to be now focusing on.
And okay, do you have I think you might have more of a whole lot opinion on that.
Well, I think, Halima, you know, you raised some really valid points. And one of the things that we see in Tower Hamlets is housing injustice. We've got Canary Wharf. We've got thousands of empty properties over there. We've got 23,000 people on the waiting list for housing in Tower Hamlets. I think in the last 10 years, they've built something like 700 units. That's ridiculous. You know, there are people now. Tower Hamlets last week announced that their housing strategy is to resolve this crisis is going to be to move people out of the borough. So you're going to take people away from their families, their support networks, their schools. If you've got a job, you're going to be moved away from your job. Universal credit will then lead you and leave you in poverty. So this housing issue it's massive. It's not just, you know, housing, it's not just vertical. You know, these issues are horizontal and they spread all across, you know, the lives of our communities. I think Tower Hamlets, you know, are designing their problem out of the borough rather than look at, you know, housing people in those empty units in Canary Wharf and keep people in their local communities where their local support networks are. You know, we're just having these giant glass and steel monoliths that are, you know, going to be the follies of the future. So what do I think the real solutions are? Use what is on the ground already. Repurpose some of those expensive units to house some of our community. Are we saying that they don't deserve good housing? And I noticed the difference between what we call, you know, social housing, affordable housing. Much of that housing is not affordable for our local residents because it is outside of the local housing allowance. So I think that yes, you know, we're facing these huge inequalities. Again, it's not just housing, it's income, it's health, it's, you know, the concrete jungle that is Tower Hamlets, it's pressure on resources. And it's really, is there a will within, you know, central government and within local government working together to resolve these issues again? And I use the word meaningful because we have a lot of policies that are, you know, well thought out, but when they translate to people on the ground, actually they decimate people's lives.
Thank you very much. And Tony, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, just very briefly before we wrap up.
I will be brief, but I could talk about housing forever. Just to say what Helena said, that when you design for the people most affected, that benefits wider society. And when we've done things for people who have visible and non-visible disabilities, again, everybody gets benefited. One of the things I will say is I'm about to start a co-design project around housing and looking at housing insecurity with some colleagues at JRF, because it is a real issue. And just going back to what I said, instead of saying this is what will happen, and get a group of people with lived experience, a group of people with learned experience together in the same room and see what we can produce.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, Halima, Annika, and Tony, for such an insightful discussion. I think to wrap up, just thinking about the idea, you know, these issues are not, these stats are not new. We knew, people on the ground know this, people in the sphere know this, people with lived experiences know when something's off, and the stats just help back it up. But as an analyst, as a senior analyst, someone who, you know, I say to my husband always that I am always elbow deep in data for parts of the day. I think for me, the biggest barrier sometimes to even trying to do some of the work is sometimes data. That sometimes the data does not go, is not in a format or is granular enough for me to do my work, or for people in this sphere to really do the deep dives that we would like, so we can find the targeted solutions that are necessary to help start alleviating some of this inequality and the poverty. And so I think for us, the main ask would be for all government data collections to evaluate what it would take to be able to present data by disaggregated ethnic groups, and start to take the steps needed to see if it could happen where feasible. So, and this would be, you know, just adding a question on ethnicity to a questionnaire, something just as simple as that. Or even it would be just looking at bigger sample sizes, so that when I'm trying to put together a data set or put together some analysis on BME, but I'm really, quite frankly, maybe I'm only interested in the Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups, I am able to separate them out as Pakistani as a group on their own and Bangladeshi as a group on their own, which would be really, really important to understand, again, the nuances between these groups, because they're not the same. We don't all have the same experience, even within the Black culture. We do not all have the same experiences in poverty. So it'd be great if our data could reflect that. So again, I would like to thank everyone here who has shown up, participated. There were loads of questions that we could not get to. I am so sorry for that. But it was just so amazing to listen to everyone speak through their expertise and also where we should be going forward to in the future. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.